Bernard Holt found the napkin at 11 o'clock at night, 6 months after his wife's funeral, sitting on the floor of their bedroom closet with a handbag in his lap that he had no memory of Marion ever carrying. He had been putting off this particular closet for half a year, working around it the way you work around a bruise, clearing out drawers and shelves and the ordinary accumulation of 46 years of marriage, while leaving the back corner, where a handful of old handbags sat stacked on a shelf above the shoe rack, untouched. He had finally made himself start that evening, mostly because his daughter, Paula, had gently suggested during their last phone call that avoiding one particular corner of one particular closet for 6 months was probably not, in her words, actually about the closet. The handbag was small, structured, a style that had gone out of fashion decades earlier. The kind of bag Marion would ordinarily have donated years ago, given how consistently, throughout their entire marriage, she had pared down anything she no longer used. Bernard turned it over in his hands, puzzled by its simple presence on the shelf, and unzipped an interior pocket he almost missed entirely, tucked along the lining in a way that suggested it had been designed to be overlooked. Inside was a paper napkin, folded into a small, tight square, its creases worn soft with age and handling. He unfolded it carefully. Printed faintly across one corner, in the fading ink of a decades-old advertisement, were the words, "The Blue Kettle Diner," along with an address in a town Bernard did not immediately recognize. Beneath the printed logo, in handwriting that was unmistakably not Marion's tidy, forward-leaning script, someone had written a phone number. No name, no date, just 10 digits, in a looping, unfamiliar hand, on a napkin that had clearly been folded and unfolded so many times over so many years that its creases had gone soft as cloth. Bernard sat on the closet floor for a long time, holding the small square of paper, feeling the specific vertigo of discovering something that should not have surprised him as much as it did. A woman he had known for 46 years, married for 44 of them, had apparently carried a stranger's phone number, folded and refolded countless times, in the bottom of a handbag she never used, and had never once, in all those years, mentioned its existence. He looked at the number for a long while before he understood, with a clarity that startled him, that he had already decided to call it. He dialed slowly, his hands unsteady in a way that embarrassed him slightly. Alone in his own closet at 11 at night, an old man calling a number that had probably been disconnected or reassigned decades ago. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, older, cautious, the voice of someone who did not receive calls at this hour and had picked up mostly out of concern that something might be wrong. Hello? Bernard opened his mouth and found for several long seconds that he did not have the first sentence of whatever this conversation was supposed to be. Bernard Holt was 74 years old, a retired accountant who had spent 38 years at the same regional firm before finally stepping back from the work 3 years earlier at Marion's gentle but persistent encouragement. He had married Marion Castellano in 1977, having met her the previous year at a mutual friend's engagement party, where she had, according to the story they told at every anniversary dinner for over 4 decades, spent the first 20 minutes of their acquaintance correcting his math on a bet involving the number of guests likely to show up. Their marriage had been, by any honest measure, a genuinely good one, not without its ordinary difficulties, the strains of raising 2 children on modest means, the particular tensions that 4.5 decades inevitably produce, but built on a foundation Bernard had never once seriously doubted. A deep, settled compatibility, an ease of communication that had, if anything, strengthened rather than eroded over the years. Marion had been, in Bernard's understanding of her, a woman defined by a particular kind of decisive clarity. She kept an orderly house, not from anxiety, but from genuine preference, and had maintained across their entire marriage a consistent habit of paring down anything unnecessary. Clothes she no longer wore, furniture that no longer served a purpose, boxes of accumulated clutter that most families let build up in attics and basements for decades. She donated, she discarded, she kept remarkably little from her past beyond a modest selection of family photographs and a handful of items with clear sentimental weight: her mother's wedding ring, a few letters from her own parents, both long deceased. She had grown up in a small town 4 hours from where she and Bernard eventually settled, had moved to the city alone at 22 to attend a 2-year secretarial program, and had built, in the years before meeting Bernard, a modest, independent life that she rarely discussed in great detail. Though Bernard had never found this unusual. Most people, he'd always assumed, spoke less about the years before marriage than the years within it, simply because a shared life naturally generated more collective memory than a life lived separately. He had believed across 46 years that he knew Marion completely, not every fact of her biography, necessarily, but the essential architecture of who she was, the values and instincts and quiet certainties that had guided her through every decision he'd witnessed her make. He had believed, without ever explicitly articulating the belief, that this was what a good marriage actually meant: not simply loving someone, but knowing them so thoroughly that no significant rooms remain closed between you. Marion had died 6 months earlier, quickly and without extended suffering, a heart condition that had given them only 11 days between diagnosis and the end. 11 days Bernard had spent almost entirely at her bedside, talking, remembering, saying. He had believed at the time everything that needed saying between two people who had already told each other nearly everything of consequence over 4.5 decades. Their daughter, Paula, 41 and living 2 hours away with her own family, called him most days since the funeral, checking in with the specific, watchful concern of an adult child worried about a parent left suddenly, permanently alone after a lifetime of partnership. She had noticed, over the preceding months, certain small, persistent habits Bernard had not fully registered in himself: the way he still occasionally set 2 coffee cups out in the morning before catching himself, the way he sometimes started a sentence with, "Your mother always said," before trailing off, unable to finish the thought without her there to finish it alongside him. "You're allowed to actually grieve, Dad," Paula had told him more than once. "Not just keep busy, not just manage the estate and clean out closets, actually sit with it." Bernard had generally assured her he was managing fine, that keeping busy was simply how he processed things, that some people weren't built for extended emotional dwelling, and there was no use pretending otherwise at 74 years old. He had not expected, walking into that closet on an ordinary Tuesday evening, to find something that would make keeping busy considerably more complicated than simply sorting through old handbags. The woman on the phone identified herself, cautiously, as Adele Winslow, and confirmed, after a long, careful silence following Bernard's halting explanation of who he was and why he was calling, that she did not immediately recognize the name Marion Holt. "Castellano," Bernard offered, his voice unsteady. Her maiden name was Marion Castellano. She would have been about 22, 23. This would have been, I don't know exactly when, but the napkin I found, it's from a diner called the Blue Kettle. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Bernard began to wonder if the call had dropped. "The Blue Kettle," Adele repeated slowly. "I worked there for years, when I was young. That was a long time ago. Do you remember a Marion? Dark hair, would have been in her early 20s, probably passing through. I don't actually know the circumstances. I just found this napkin in her things, with your number on it, and I don't know why she kept it. I don't know why she never told me about it." Adele was quiet again for a long moment. "I wrote a lot of numbers on a lot of napkins over the years I worked there," she said finally, carefully. "I don't know that I can place one specific young woman from— how long ago are we talking about?" "She'd have been about 22. She married me in 1977, so this would have been some time before that." That's a very long time ago, Adele said, and something in her voice had shifted, grown more guarded, in a way Bernard couldn't immediately interpret. I'd need some time to think. I'm sorry, this is a strange call to receive at 11 at night from a stranger. I don't mean anything unkind by that. It's simply a lot to take in all at once. I understand, Bernard said, though he found himself reluctant to end the call, some instinct telling him that if he let this moment close without extracting more, he might never get another chance at it. Can I call you again? In a few days, maybe? Once you've had time to think? There was another pause, shorter this time. Yes, Adele said finally. I think, yes. Give me a few days. The line went quiet. Bernard sat on his closet floor for a long time afterward, the napkin still in his hand, feeling the specific disorientation of having reached, however tentatively, into a part of his wife's life he had never once known existed, and finding, on the other end, not clarity, but only the promise of more waiting. Bernard did not sleep well over the following days. He found himself returning, repeatedly, to the old photo albums Marion had kept in the living room bookshelf, searching through images from the years before their marriage, a handful of photographs from her secretarial program, a few group pictures from her early 20s that Bernard had looked at 100 times over the decades without ever examining them with the specific, urgent attention he now brought to them. He noticed things he had never noticed before, a particular tightness around Marion's eyes in several photographs from what he now understood must have been the year before they met, a tension in her smile that he had always simply attributed to unfamiliar cameras or awkward posing, and which now, viewed through the lens of an unexplained napkin and a stranger's careful, guarded voice on the phone, struck him as something closer to a young woman working hard to appear fine. He called Paula on the third day and told her everything, the handbag, the napkin, the phone call, Adele Winslow's careful, uncertain voice. Paula was quiet for a long moment on the line. Dad, she said finally, I think you need to be careful here. You're 6 months into grieving Mom, and now you've found this mystery, and I love you, but I think you might be using this as a way to avoid actually sitting with the grief itself. It's easier to chase a puzzle than to just feel how much you miss her. That's not what this is, Bernard said, though something in Paula's observation landed with more force than he wanted to admit. Isn't it? Paula asked gently. You've spent 6 months barely talking about how you're actually doing, and the one time you call me sounding genuinely animated, it's about a napkin from before either of us were even alive. I'm not saying don't look into it. I'm just saying I think you should ask yourself honestly what you're actually looking for. Bernard sat with this for a long time after the call ended, turning the observation over with the same discomfort he'd felt decades earlier, whenever Marion had pointed out some blind spot in his own behavior with the same gentle, unwelcome accuracy. He thought, that evening, about a specific pattern in Marion's own behavior that he had never previously examined closely. A quiet, private mood that settled over her every year in early autumn, lasting perhaps a day or two, during which she would take a long, solitary walk in the early morning, before Bernard woke, returning without explanation, resuming the day's ordinary rhythm, as though nothing unusual had occurred. He had asked about it, early in their marriage, and had received an answer vague enough that he'd stop asking after the first few years, absorbing it the way you absorb any long-standing habit of a person you love, as simply part of who she was, not requiring further explanation. He understood now, sitting with the photographs and the napkin and Paula's uncomfortable observation, that the early autumn walk and the worn creases on a folded napkin were very likely connected in ways he had spent 4.5 decades not curious enough to ask about. Adele called back on the 5th day, her voice steadier than it had been during their first conversation. I think I remember her, she said, without preamble. I've been turning it over since you called, and I think there was a night, a long time ago, a young woman came into the diner very late, alone, clearly upset about something. I don't remember every detail, but I remember writing my home number on a napkin for her before she left. I don't know for certain it was the same woman, but the timing feels right, and something about what you've described feels familiar. Bernard felt his chest tighten. Can you tell me what happened that night? Adele was quiet for a moment. I can tell you some of it, she said carefully. I want to be honest with you, though. It was over 50 years ago, and I only spoke with her the one time, for a few hours, and never again after that. I don't know the whole story. I only know what she told me that night, and I'm not entirely certain I remember all of it accurately after this many years. I think, if you're willing to hear an incomplete picture, I can tell you what I do remember, but I don't want you thinking I can hand you the whole truth. Some of it, I suspect, is going to stay exactly where it's always been, with her. Bernard flew out to meet Adele Winslow in person 3 weeks later, unable to shake the sense that whatever remained of this story deserved to be received face-to-face rather than compressed into the thin, imperfect medium of a phone line. Adele lived alone in a modest house outside a mid-sized city several states away, 81 years old now, sharp-eyed and careful in her movements, greeting Bernard at her door with the particular caution of someone who had spent 3 weeks deciding how much of a 50-year-old memory she actually owed a grieving stranger. They sat together in her small living room, a pot of tea between them that neither of them drank much of, and Adele told him, slowly and with visible care, what she remembered of the night in question. It would have been the autumn of 1974, she said. I was working the overnight shift at the Blue Kettle. We stayed open all night back then, mostly for truckers and shift workers, and it was quiet usually, after midnight. A young woman came in alone, sometime after 2 in the morning. She had a suitcase with her, which wasn't unusual for that hour. We got our share of people passing through, catching early buses, but something about her was different. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee and didn't touch it, and I could see she'd been crying, though she was trying hard not to show it. Bernard sat very still, listening. I asked her if she was all right. The way you do, Adele continued. She said she was fine, the way people say that when they very clearly aren't. I let it go for a while. Sometimes people need space before they're ready to talk, if they talk at all. But it was quiet, and I had time, and eventually, near dawn, she started talking. Not everything, not all at once, but enough that I understood she'd left something behind that night. An engagement, I believe, though I don't remember the specific details of the man involved, only that she described him as someone who frightened her more than she'd let herself admit until that very night. I remember she said something about finally understanding that staying would have cost her more than leaving would. Bernard felt something tighten in his chest, the specific, disorienting grief of learning, decades after the fact, that the woman he'd married had once stood at the edge of a life considerably darker than the one he had always assumed preceded him. She didn't have anywhere to go that night, Adele continued. No family nearby she felt she could call. Not yet. Not until she'd had time to think. I sat with her until the early bus came through, just before 6. I didn't push her to explain more than she was ready to. I've always believed some of the most important things you can offer a frightened person are simply your presence and your silence, in whatever combination they actually need. And the napkin, Bernard said quietly. Before she left, I wrote my home number down and gave it to her. I told her, I remember this part clearly because I said some version of it to more than one frightened young woman who passed through that diner over the years. I told her that if she ever needed someone in the middle of the night who wouldn't ask her to explain herself, she could call that number, any hour, and I'd answer. Adele looked down at her own hands, folded in her lap. She thanked me. She got on the bus. I never heard from her again. I assumed, over the years, that she'd either lost the number, or forgotten it, or simply never needed it again, and I was glad, honestly, to think it might be the last one, that whatever she'd been running from that night, she'd managed to build a life good enough that she never needed a stranger's number again. Bernard sat with this for a long moment. the weight of it settling slowly through his chest. "She kept it," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "For 50 years. In a bag she stopped using decades ago. In a pocket meant to be overlooked. The creases were worn soft. She must have taken it out and looked at it, more than once, over all those years." Adele's eyes filled unexpectedly at this. "I didn't know that," she said quietly. "In 50 years, nobody's ever told me that. I always wondered, honestly, whether any of those numbers I handed out over the years actually mattered to anyone, or whether they just got thrown away with the rest of the night's trash." She paused. "Knowing she kept it, that changes something for me too. I don't quite have the words yet for what." "Do you know who he was?" Bernard asked after a long silence had settled between them. "The man she was engaged to? Anything else about that night? Where she'd been living? Why that specific evening was the one where she finally left?" Adele shook her head slowly. "I wish I could tell you more," she said. "I only had those few hours with her, over 50 years ago. I don't remember a name, if she ever gave one. I don't know the specifics of what made that particular night the breaking point, only that something had, and that she was frightened enough to leave with nothing but a suitcase and nowhere immediate to go." She looked at Bernard directly. "I think you have to understand, some of what happened that night belongs entirely to her. I was present for a few hours of a story that was much larger than what I witnessed, and I don't have the rest of it. I don't think anyone does, except her, and she's gone now." Bernard absorbed this slowly, feeling the specific unfamiliar grief of accepting an incompleteness he had spent 3 weeks hoping might eventually resolve into something whole. "I think I wanted there to be a full answer," he admitted. "Some explanation that would make complete sense of everything, so I could finally understand this whole hidden part of her life. I think I've been telling myself that if I just found enough pieces, I could reconstruct the entire picture, and then I'd finally feel like I knew her completely again." "I don't think that's how any of this works," Adele said gently. "Not for you, and not for me either. I've spent my whole life handing out kindness to strangers in the middle of the night, and I very rarely get to learn what happened to any of them afterward. I made peace with that a long time ago, that most of what I gave simply went out into the world and either helped or didn't, and I'd likely never know which. I think, in a strange way, not knowing was part of what made it possible to keep doing it. If I'd needed the full story every time, I don't think I could have kept showing up for strangers the way I did." Bernard looked down at the napkin, which he had brought with him, carefully preserved now in a small protective sleeve. "I don't think I can have the full story," he said slowly, testing the sentence as he said it. "I think I have to be all right with that." "I think you do," Adele said, "but I don't think that means you have nothing. I think you have something considerably more specific than a full explanation. You have proof that on one of the worst nights of your wife's life, a stranger showed her enough kindness that she carried the memory of it, physically, in her handbag for 50 years. That's not nothing, Bernard. I think if anything that might be more valuable than knowing every detail of what she was actually running from." Bernard flew home 3 days later, the napkin carefully packed among his belongings, and told Paula everything over dinner the following weekend, the full account, exactly as Adele had given it to him, including the parts that remained frustratingly, permanently incomplete. Paula listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her eyes bright. "I don't think I ever really thought about Mom having a whole life before us," she said finally. "Not really. Not as someone who was ever actually frightened or desperate or running from something in the middle of the night. I think I always just thought of her as Mom. Steady, sure of everything. It's strange to think of her as young and scared and alone at a diner counter. I think I did the same thing," Bernard admitted. 46 years, and I don't think I ever once really imagined her as someone who existed fully before she met me. I think I assumed the person I knew was simply the whole person, start to finish, and I never really considered that she might have built that person out of something considerably harder before I ever showed up." "Are you angry that she never told you?" Paula asked. Bernard considered this seriously, the question deserving more than a reflexive answer. "I was for a while," he said slowly. "I think underneath the curiosity, there was something like betrayal, the sense that if she'd really loved me completely, she should have told me everything. And the fact that she didn't meant maybe our marriage wasn't quite what I'd always believed it was." He paused, looking at the napkin on the table between them. "I don't feel that anymore. I think I understand now that people can love you completely and still have rooms of themselves they never open, not because they're hiding something shameful, but because some things are simply too tender, too private, too fully their own to hand over to anyone else, even someone they've built an entire life alongside. I think that night belonged to her in a way that had nothing to do with how much she loved me. I think keeping it private wasn't a failure of our marriage. I think it was just her being a whole separate person, with a history that started before I ever knew her." Paula reached across the table and took her father's hand. "I think that's a healthier way to hold it than being angry," she said quietly. "I think Mom would have liked hearing you say that." "I think you were right too," Bernard said, "about what you told me on the phone weeks ago. I think I was using this whole search as a way to avoid actually feeling how much I miss her. I think I'm still avoiding it, some days, but I think finding this, understanding it, as much as I'm able to, has actually let me miss her more completely, somehow. Not just missing the woman who was my wife for 46 years, missing the whole person, even the parts I never got to know." Bernard visited the site of the Blue Kettle Diner the following spring, driving the 4 hours alone on a clear morning in April, understanding before he arrived that the building itself would almost certainly no longer exist in any recognizable form after 50 years. He was right. The address Adele had given him, cross-referenced against the faded printing on the napkin, now belonged to a small strip of modern retail storefronts, a nail salon, a mobile phone store, a coffee chain with the specific, anonymous uniformity of 1,000 identical locations across the country. Nothing remained of the diner where a frightened young woman had once sat at a counter in the middle of the night, unable to touch her coffee, slowly finding the words to explain why she couldn't go back to wherever she'd come from. Bernard stood in the parking lot for a while regardless, understanding that the pilgrimage had never really been about finding a physical trace of that night. It had been about standing, once, in the approximate location where his wife had made a decision, alone, at 22 years old, that had eventually, through a long chain of choices and chances he would never fully be able to trace, led her to a party 3 years later where she would correct a stranger's math on a bet and become, over the following 4.5 decades, the person Bernard had built his entire adult life alongside. He kept the napkin framed in his study after that, alongside a small handwritten note from Adele Winslow that had arrived a few weeks after his visit, a brief, warm letter thanking him for making the long trip, for telling her what had become of a kindness she'd offered decades earlier and never expected to learn the outcome of, and expressing a hope that they might stay in occasional touch, two strangers now bound together by a woman neither of them would ever fully explain, and both of whom had loved her, in their own very different ways, for the parts of her they'd each been given. He did not, in the end, ever learn the man's name, or the full shape of what Marion had fled that autumn night in 1974. He came to understand, slowly, over the months that followed, that this was not a wound he needed to keep worrying at until it closed. It was simply the outline of a door that had always existed inside his wife, a door she had chosen, for reasons entirely her own, never to fully open, not out of secrecy or deception, but because some rooms, he was beginning to understand, are meant to belong to exactly one person, held privately across an entire lifetime, visited alone in the early hours of a specific morning each year, and released, finally, only when that person is no longer here to hold them. On the anniversary of Marion's death, Bernard took an early morning walk of his own, not because he fully understood what she had felt on her own solitary autumn walks across 4.5 decades, but because he wanted, in whatever small and imperfect way he was able, to walk alongside the shape of a habit she had kept privately for so long, now finally understood, if not fully explained. He carried nothing with him except the knowledge, hard-won and still settling, that loving someone completely had never actually required knowing everything about them, only trusting that whatever they chose to keep folded quietly away was theirs to keep, and that the folding itself, worn soft with 50 years of private handling, was its own kind of testimony to a love and a kindness that had mattered enough to carry, unexplained, for an entire lifetime. Some numbers, once dialed, answer everything. Others, Bernard had learned, answer only enough to prove that the question mattered, and let the rest remain exactly where its owner decided, long ago, it belonged. Estimated voiceover word count, approximately 8,300 words. This video is a dramatized narrative inspired by real human emotions, experiences, and life-changing moments. Any resemblance to specific real events or people is coincidental. Closing question for comments: if you found something like this among a loved one's belongings, proof of a private history they never shared with you, would you want the full story, or would you rather let some of it stay theirs alone?